I mean, I can't even, this is actually part of the last question I want to ask about the solutions of racelessness if it was implemented. So I'm actually going to save this. But I want to say that you say doing away with race is how we can get at racism. For me, I think racial reconciliation starts with people willing to just fundamentally, basically, just critically think, because thinking requires you to wait before you act or respond. It also requires you to have patience, like it demands you to be patient. So if people critically thought about who people are or about certain topics or even about national or local racial incidents, that will inevitably open people to operate on logical sensing and not on their implicit biases. And to me, one cannot reconcile with something they are not willing to understand first. So, and I'll say it again, I don't think reconciling with race means negating race out of the picture. I think reconciling with race is more so engaging with what has happened to us, which you've said, and reframing how we see people inside race. I think that is realistic, and I think that has longevity throughout time. So that's my position on it. I think the real crux of the issue is the fact that people just don't think about things. We assume too much, and it is because we see people's skin color and just assume something based on our biases. And this is something I actively try to work on every day when it comes up, when it flares up, if you want to say, because it's not just white people that have implicit biases. Everyone does. I do. Every single person does. But the thing is I actively make sure that when they come up, because they even come up before you even realize they're there, but when they're there in my mind, I take it to task and I vet it, and I don't act upon those things. And now more so, it doesn't necessarily come up as much as it used to. And I'll even say this, for example, there's certain circumstances that's happened, certain things that's happened. Just for example, the Olympics with Sha'Carri Richardson, I believe her name. And when I was told, because I was in Washington, D.C., I believe, when this happened, this was like 4th of July, something around there. And when I read the story and I was like, dang, like she did weed and she can't, compete. It sucks, but it's like, I wasn't even thinking racism. I wasn't even thinking like, this is white supremacy getting at her. I was thinking, dang it, like she's been through a lot. And I personally really like her, and I'm still, hoping for the best for her. And she'll compete, but that's neither here nor there. But I was like, dang, like she's been through a lot, and I understand probably why she did it, but man, I wish she didn't do it. And I was more mad at her team, if anything. And then when I saw all the conversation and narratives, and even AOC tweeting out that this is racist, and I was like, how is this racist? This is literally policy. Like, they know that they're going to be tested after they run or before they run. They know that they're not supposed to take enhancement drugs or any type of drugs. This was a decision she made, a choice. And luckily, she has taken responsibility for it. And I don't even think that she's been thriving on that narrative of this is white supremacy. It's a narrative around her, but I don't know if she's been thriving on that. But like I said, like that I can clearly see as through logical sensing. This makes sense. Okay, close the computer. It sucks. And I wanted her to compete because she's awesome. But then when I heard other conversations and my friends tweeting me or whoever, and I'm like, you guys have to talk to me about it. And I actually had a discussion with a friend, and it got kind of heated. Still love him. But I was like, you have to logically explain to me why this is racist. Like, you have to. More or less, it was an anecdotal reason of why this person felt so passionate. But like I said before, like, I was able not to operate within falling into the traps of considering everyone at the Olympics, white or whatever they are, as racist. And I operate within my race identity as Black. And I wasn't saying, well, yeah, they're racist. That is what it is because what they did to this other Black. No, I didn't even think about Black. I just thought Olympian drugs. They did that to Lance Armstrong. Like they took away his stuff. So that's what I mean by critically thinking. And it's just something when you start doing it a lot and it just becomes like your go-to, that's just your number one, that's your A plan of everything, is to critically think. Sometimes you piss people off because they're like, you don't see what's going on. I'm like, no, you don't see it because you haven't thought about it. You're operating off of a feeling, or you're operating off an assumption. And that's not what's happening here. So that's my thoughts on that. I really think it's critically thinking. And you did touch upon, so I know what you're saying about certain racism is something we shouldn't focus on, like interpersonal racism, but you're talking about systemic racism is the thing that is dire to focus on more so. But I asked you this question before because you don't see race, or I want to say see race, you don't believe in white or black. So you don't believe white supremacy. I'm guessing you it's more race supremacy for you, correct?
That's actually, oh my gosh. So Dr. Carter and I recently co-authored a chapter, and he put white supremacy, but he knows, so he's a social constructionist eliminativist. I'm a skeptic eliminativist. So we changed the language from white to race supremacy. I don't see any huge benefit or even a small benefit to differentiating racism from racism from racism. I see white supremacy as being racism. I see anti-Black racism as being racism. I no longer see any real benefit to differentiating between the forms of racism. I think racism is racism.
Okay. So, well, to that, I think white supremacy means so many things where it means nothing. Like when people describe an incident that occurred, like there's better language and more concise terms that people can use besides cloaking it, everything under white supremacy.
Sure.
Things become
I feel that way about Blackness.
Yeah. And we can get into that. But I believe like most people believe white supremacy is like the default of America. America operates on white supremacy. But when you break down the term, supremacy literally means the state or condition of being superior to all others in authority, power, and status. So if you attach white to supremacy, it means the state of condition where white people are superior to all others in authority, power, status. And in America, you could say this is true, and it is true, but it's not the whole truth. And that if America really operated solely on white supremacy, then no Black person or any minority would be in any positions of control or influence. And that's not to say that people are propped up for optics in roles to look good, but I'm saying like people that are like actually have economic wealth, have real influence from like culture to political influence. And it might seem to some people that I'm dismissing or negating the power out of that term, but I'm not. I actually take racism and white supremacy and racial discrimination very seriously. And I'm frustrated when people consider every little thing as white supremacy overshadowing real situations. So for me, when I say like racism can't end, I don't say in a flippant way, like racism can't end to me, yes. And like you, I'm more focused on the racism that's like more ingrained, the things that fundamentally affect minorities and Black people. Interpersonal racism, I often talk about how, like if someone calls me the N-word, this has not happened. I mean, people have called me N-word, but since I've said this, I haven't been called N-word in person. But on an interpersonal level, if someone calls me the N-word and I don't react, to me, they don't get any power from me. Like the power is my reaction. And I believe a writer said this, and I want to say it was Shelby Steele. He said that Black anger flatters white power. Mm-hmm. That if someone calls you the N-word, it's only a word lingering in the air. It means nothing until you react. And it's not to put responsibility completely on the recipient. Like, it's your fault. If you react, it becomes a thing. No, it's more so to reframe it like you have the power, actually. Like, they threw you the only ammo they have. And by you not reacting, you actually disempower them. So yes, there are different types of racism in this world, from the most minute to the most extreme. I'm more focused on the extreme, the day-to-day things that even I get on the internet. I don't care. Not to say I don't care, because I don't want to act like, oh, I don't care. But ever since BLM, I've been called out on my name. So it's something I know that happens when you're in the public eye and you're talking about race. I mean, I know it's going to happen, and these people don't know me. So I take it under the chin. But so, yeah, so you call it race supremacy because, and you don't separate it with like, oh, it's white race supremacy, because you believe race is the supremacy. Just so people understand.
It's definitely ironic, because so this was a chapter that we co-authored for an Oxford Handbook on Art and Ethics that's coming out by Oxford University Press. And it's specifically focusing on the Harlem Renaissance. Now, if it was a single authored chapter, Dr. Carter's going to get a chuckle out of this. I wouldn't have put any supremacy thing. I would have just put racism. I wouldn't have put race supremacy. It only ended up being that because it was a term that he wanted to use at the time. And I respect and honor and value the fact that he views race as a social construction, whereas I am skeptic about it, right? And so we use that language. But as we're talking about it, for me, yes, the term race supremacy is redundant, and sort of unnecessarily so. I could almost even shorten it just to supremacy, but I think the word race does that in and of itself, at least in my own work, because I am pointing to the fact that with race, because racism is race and race is racism, that there's a hierarchy, that there is some form of supremacy that's operating in how race plays out in society and in how people conceive of race. And from my standpoint, I agree with you that racism can't end completely. We do agree there. But I also would say that racism can't even end in part so long as we continue to uphold and promote and privilege race ideology. Why? Well, because we've been reconstructing it since before America was a country. And maybe in part two, I can open the floor with like actually defining the philosophies that I mentioned earlier, because it's not something we've talked about yet. But the most common default position in America tends to be this one of Reconstruction. And we've been literally reconstructing race since before it was a country. That's centuries long of reconstructing it. So to me, it is partially a question of practicality. I mean, I think the sort of cheeky definition of insanity is doing the same thing more than once and expecting a different result. I don't think that we can ever get to a place where our reconstruction efforts will pay off in the ways that we would want or hope, which again isn't the complete elimination of the problem, but just like a lessening of the problem, if you will. I don't see how we get there if we continue to try to reconstruct. I think it's time to be more radical and revolutionary in our thinking. Sometimes people say revolution, radical, dirty words. I'm not fearful of using those words. I recognize my ideas as indeed being radical and revolutionary. And hopefully everyone who's listening can see that and recognize it for what it is. This is not a case of colorblindness or anything of that matter. What I'm saying is 100% radical. We need to eliminate race because that's eliminating racism. And Not, again, not to the, oh, racism doesn't exist at all thing. No, I don't think that that is possible or practical, or even, I don't even think that should be the goal. I do think that we can get to a statistical majority. We can shift that so that more than half of the country is what we could identify as anti-racist, and that shift would then become reflected in our policies and our institutions and so on and so forth. And then we'd have a lot more work to do still, focusing primarily on socioeconomic status to actually make the changes that you and I are talking about. Because one thing that Coleman Hughes, John McWhorter, I keep forgetting if it's John McWhorter or McWhorton. I always want to change his last name. Glenn Lowry. One thing that they talk about often is this, in misnaming the problem, kind of as you just said, and kind of this indiscriminate labeling of everything as racist or about white supremacy at work. We then unintentionally avoid solving the actual problem. And the example that Coleman Hughes gave that I felt like was very persuasive was in instances of affirmative action at institutes of higher learning. If we look at their data to see who are they admitting that qualify or identify themselves as racialized people of color or Black people, that those people tend to be immigrants or children of immigrants, they're middle class, they're upper class. So that policy is supposed to be solving for racism, but poor racialized Black people are still poor racialized Black people. Not all Black people are poor. Let's make that clear, right? Not all Black people are poor, but there are a disproportionate number of us who are in underserved communities. And so I think it's like a twofold thing where I don't want to idealize the ending of racism, because actually some of the really biggest problems that keep me awake at night that I really work intensely to try to solve for in some small way involves socioeconomic status. Mm-hmm. And kind of like what you said, it's like, it's almost too easy to point to something and be like, oh, racism. And then it's almost like what's implied is it's only racism and it's nothing else. So with Sha'Carri, I was so rooting for her. I saw her last race when she qualified for the Olympics, and I was like, oh my God, yes. And I was living for the orange hair.
Yeah. I love it all.
I love her.
I love it all.
And when that all unfolded, and to your point, when I saw the reaction, I was really questioning, is it racism though? Like, is it? I mean, to your point, if they could test any person. Maybe that's the problem. People feel like she shouldn't have been tested in the first place, right?
Yeah, everyone was tested. Now, if they just tested her, heck yeah. I mean,
they tested everyone?
Yeah, they tested everyone, yeah.
Oh.
If it was just her, then yeah. I mean, you have a huge case on why that is racist.
Right.
But if it is every single person, because I made sure that was the case, and it is. Okay. They tested everyone.
Well, see, there you go. But as soon as you identify something or some happening as racist or white supremacy or whatever language you want to apply to it, it's almost the end of the conversation, right? Like, why does it seem like in popular discourse, as soon as somebody's identified as being racist, a Karen or a Ken, right? It's like, oh, you're racist. And then that's the end of nothing happens after that. Like, the person gets fired. They go off lurking in the shadows. They crawl back under the rock that they've been living under. I don't know. They continue to be racist, but maybe they just don't make sure they don't go viral with it. And like, what's actually solved with the Sha'Carri incident? Again, what's actually solved by the pointing to and labeling it as racism? What's solved? It really serves to, I think you mentioned this at the start, so I feel like we're coming 360 now. You mentioned the sort of mainstream narrative. I'm searching for the exact term that you used, but it was something to that effect of like, the mainstream narrative is X, Y, and Z. And in these cases, the mainstream narrative is this pointing to racism, the patting, oneself on the back for being so liberal and so progressive and so on the right side of things, right? Because we convince ourselves that all conservatives are racist. It's like, to me, it's a farce, and it actually does more damage and more harm than good, and it's not solving the actual problems, because we're not even naming the problems, and it only, to me, it really only, not only, but it does serve to further divide people, and that those divisions are along perceived racial lines. That is a thing. And the people who benefit the most from that continued perpetuated division, which has been really at the start since, I would say, especially after Emancipation, Reconstruction era, that division primarily serves the very, very, very small percentage of people who have the most economic and political power in this country. So the people it's supposedly benefiting, it being racism, supposedly it's benefiting white people. We have white privilege and all this other stuff.
Mm.
But like, make no mistake about it, the average racialized white person doesn't actually get the benefit that people profess them to actually have. And if they were to open their eyes and actually realize that, they would also vote differently. They would talk about these problems differently. They would feel differently about these problems. And that, to me, is one of the biggest and most significant downfalls of using race language, or the concept of race, or race ideology, in efforts to actually do anti-racist work. Because as soon as race is present in something, I mean, I don't know if you've heard All Lives Matter, but that's a response to Black Lives Matter. Why? Maybe because the people who are saying all lives matter are racist. Maybe they have racist ideas. But I would say it's actually way more complicated than that. That when race is present in the discourse and in our efforts to actually end racism, people have been programmed to actually not see themselves in a race that is not described as their own. So people don't see themselves in blackness and Black if they're not racialized as Black, or Black being a part of Blackness. And that is a problem. That is a barrier. Because for those people who have a hard time seeing through the smoke, how can you come to the table with those same people and have a meaningful, generative conversation about racism when they're not even able to see the problem? Because all they're seeing is race, and all they're seeing is difference, and all they're seeing is presumed differences too. Let's be clear, race does homogenize people in American imaginations. You and I might not fall victim to that, but the majority of people, or maybe just a lot too many people, race homogenizes groups of people. So one thing that I also want to encourage is, like, even if you or I or any person watching doesn't fall victim, I hate using that word nowadays, but doesn't fall victim to that kind of thinking. For the average American, race absolutely homogenizes, washes over differences, and is created and imagined to be such that the hierarchy is arguably always present and always there. And we teach people race. We teach them the bias. That doesn't just magically come because somebody sees pale skin or they see darker skin. We teach people the bias. How do we teach them? Because we teach them race. And how do we teach them race in this country? That's a more complex conversation for definitely another day.